chapter number 18 tonight. I want us to, we'll look at verses 1. Let's look at verses 1 through, we'll try to go verses 1 through 9. Let's do verses 1 through 9. Acts chapter 18, um, and we will go with verses 1 through 9. Okay, as I always do, I'll be reading from the New King James Version, and then we'll unpack these scriptures tonight. All right, so it says this: after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. Mm. By occupation, they were tent makers, and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. But when they opposed him mm, and blasphemed, he shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles." And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, one who worshiped God. Watch this, y'all. Whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by vision. He says, "Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent." Let's go ahead and finish out verse 10. I wasn't going to go that far, but let me go ahead and finish out verse 10. He says, "For I am with you, and no one will attack you or hurt you. I have many people in this city." I'm probably not going to go that far tonight in our scripture or in our lesson tonight. But as we look at chapter 18, and as we look at where Paul has come from, where he is now, this is where he first experiences the infamous Corinthians. This is where he first experiences the infamous Corinthians. Um, Let me give you a little story right quick. A man was shoveling snow one day in his driveway, and there were two boys that were carrying snow shovels. And as they were carrying snow shovels, excuse me, um, they came up to the man and they said, "Hey, mister, shovel your snow for you?" And one of them said, "We'll do it for just $2." And so the man looked at him and he was somewhat puzzled. And he looks at him and says, "Well, can't you see that I'm doing it myself?" And the little fella said, "Well, yeah, we see that you're doing it. That's why we ask." Check this out, y'all. Because we get most of our business from people who are half through and feel like quitting. Don't miss the shout. Paul After that great experience at Philippi, he goes to Thessaloniki. And of course, he's successful in a ministerial way. He runs into opposition and gets run out of town. He leaves there and goes to Berea, and he experiences success there. They followed him from Thessaloniki to Berea. Then he gets run out of town. He then leaves because he had been with Silas and Timothy, and earlier he had been with Luke. Now he goes to Athens ahead of Timothy and Silas, and he's there by himself. And he's waiting on his friends to come. While he's there, of course, over the last couple of weeks, we talked about what his experience was there in Athens, and I would imagine that with him being there, even though he went on and ministered, and Paul was focused. Let me tell you something. Paul was focused, and so matter of fact, y'all type that. Type focus. It's a lot of people's problem. Focus and or the lack of. But Paul was focused on the mission. And as he was focused on the mission, he's there. He doesn't have his comrades with him. And so after he ministers in Athens, we see here that in chapter 18 it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. Why did I tell you that story about the man shoveling the snow? Because he's had success. It's been opposition after opposition after opposition, but he stayed focused. And there are some people, if you don't have that focus, you just feel like quitting. I posted on my social media earlier today a reference to Dr. V. Raymond Edmond. I used to do a conference there, and if Mom's on here, she remembers because I took her with me a few times. I used to do a conference there for Wheaton College at Wheaton College um, in Wheaton, Illinois. I saw some type of static. That's why I paused. If y'all ever see me pause, that's because I can hear and see stuff that looks like it's disrupting the stream. But Dr. V. Raymond Edmonds said, "It's always too soon to quit." And so as we look at what Paul is doing, he's now traveling by himself. The reason I gave you the illustration at the beginning of our time tonight was because those fellas said, man, we make most of our money off of people starting but not finishing. Paul was determined to finish. Matter of fact, somebody type that, finish. I don't care what you have to do, finish. Matter of fact, um, it's important to understand that when we talk about finishing, you're going to run across all types of obstacles, opposition, and even objections. But you have to make sure that you finish. So, Dr. Edmond, he said it's always too soon to quit. I'm saying all of that because I want us to see Paul here because um, Paul could have easily become discouraged. And I guess this means so much to me because I put myself in Paul's shoes, and sometimes you're out here and you feel like you're just moving and you're by yourself, and Lord, what you got me out here for, right? Um, but Paul was convinced, he was convicted because he was truly converted, and he was not going to quit. Um, Charles Spurgeon, many people may have heard of Charles Spurgeon, the London theologian. Um, he once said that by perseverance, the snail reached the ark. Oh, Mr. Shaw, the snail, the slowest moving animal on the planet, two of those made it to the ark. And so the idea behind that is it doesn't matter how fast you finish. What matters is that you finish. So now here we are. We're in Corinth. Corinth. Paul's gone again, one more time. Philippi had a great reception. Thessalonica, decent reception, but ran into opposition. Had a great turnout, a great return on his investment in ministry. Many people came. From Thessalonica to Berea. From Berea, same thing, kind of a reception. Had a decent return on his investment in ministry. From there, he has to go forward alone to Athens. And even there, he had a good return on his investment, stayed a while, was able to minister. Now we catch him moving on to Corinth. Corinth, now this is about 200,000 people, and a town that, or a city that large, is probably not the easiest place to start a church. There are a lot of distractions there. After he leaves Athens, he goes to this city and he goes there alone. The going was tough. And if you are familiar with the book, if you're familiar with the book of Corinthians, Paul let us know how tough it was in Corinth. Corinth's reputation um, was really for wickedness. Its location, it was both another great commercial center, both travel and trade. You had people coming in and out. You had a whole lot of money. You had a whole lot of vices. You had a whole lot of strange philosophies, um, and a whole lot of new religions. We have to remember, and I don't know if I said this in Bible study, if I said this in a conversation, but we have to remember that during this time, and even the time before Christ, um, and up to and through the time of Christ, many societies were polytheistic. There was not just a God, there were many gods. And so you have all these strange philosophies and all these new religions that would come to a place like Corinth. Why? Because you have voluminous population. You have more people there. And a lot of people would come there and they would find home there. And Achaia is, Corinth was the capital, excuse me, the capital of Achaia. And it was really one of the, I would say that Corinth and Ephesus were probably the two most important cities that Paul visited, simply because of their population and their capacity to mobilize more people at one time. But let me say this. Let me tell you this. And I've said this before. When God opens doors, the enemy tries to close them. When God begins to do things, even, and I'll just say this in a moment of transparency, um, as the Lord has prompted me to move into other areas of ministry and to do ministry in other areas, I'm not surprised at how the enemy raises his head. That's why I had you all to type two words: focus and finish. Because when God opens these doors, The enemy does everything in which he can to try to close these doors. And there are many times when we close the doors on ourselves because we wind up getting discouraged and quit. I don't know if I'm helping y'all already tonight, but I'm telling you, it's always too soon to quit. And every time, and as we see Paul here, as he's going through now in the city of Corinth, Paul, he's ministering in Corinth, and God is opening doors. And you got to know that the devil is going to try to close the doors, but God gave him a see here. Down here, there we go. So we're going to see here how Paul by himself, he's staying focused. He's committed to finishing. We're going to see here how God gives him encouragement, which is our text tonight, to keep him going. And these same encouragements that we see that God gives Paul, I want to tell you tonight, God is looking to encourage you the same way. I don't know who I'm talking to. I don't know if anybody specifically can connect with this tonight, but I pray that you are encouraged as a result of what we share. So, as we look at verses 1 through 5, really, we've already read the text, but I just kind of want to just kind of run through these first few verses here. So, Paul comes to Corinth. He's following his ministry that he had with all the philosophers in Greece, there on Mars Hill, at the Areopagus. And Paul was even more determined to magnify Jesus and the cross and to depend on the Holy Spirit. Think about it, y'all. Let me back up into last week, the last couple of weeks, right quick. For him to go and sit, even though he was a learned man, he was an educated man, sat at the feet of Gamaliel and was learned in many of the Judaistic doctrine. And for him to be able to sit and for him to identify that unknown God, and he says, I'm going to tell y'all who this God is. When he sees the success in Athens, and as they ask him to stay around and to share more, he now is moving into Corinth, and he's more determined now than ever to make sure that he magnifies Jesus, magnifies that cross, and he's going to depend heavily on the Holy Spirit. Watch this, to present the gospel simplistically. Oh, I pray that we're now coming to a point and a place in a time of ministry where we are looking to recognize the effectiveness of simple ministry. It's good to learn. It's good to have doctrinal depth. It's good to have theological information. It's good to have historical and patristic references. It's good to understand exegetical practices, homiletical presentations, expository approaches. But at the end of the day, Paul says, I just want y'all to know who Jesus is. I want you to know the power that God has given us through the Holy Spirit. And here, Paul is more determined in Corinth to teach this gospel and share this gospel with simplicity. If we look here, matter of fact, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, the first part of that, I believe he says here, and I, brethren, when I came to you, all right. And our brethren, when I came to you, did not come with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I was with you in weakness in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, mm, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. All of that, First Corinthians chapter 2, the first 4 or 5 verses there, a lot of that can identify for us tonight the context that he was dealing with. He says, I was by myself. I was fearful. I was trembling. And I'm coming in and I'm in this big city and I have all these philosophers and all of these jokers out here who are, itinerant teachers coming through Corinth. And they were preying on the ignorant and superstitious population, and they would give you highly intellectual, exuberated verbosity. And because of the presentation of their information, you would find yourself confirming what they say, no matter how wrong it is. Paul says, "That's what I came to do. I came to simply share the simplicity of Jesus Christ, the salvation that we receive as a result of his birth, life, ministry, death, burial, resurrection, and return. And as a result, between the resurrection and the return, God allowed us to house his spirit within us. And so one way Paul separated himself from these one writer one writer called them religious hucksters. I call them holy hustlers. Um, but one way that Paul, interesting here as we look at our text tonight, as we've read it, but one thing that I notice here, Paul went to work. Now, let me say this. Um, one commentator said he called them hucksters. I call them hustlers. Now, this is one thing I thought about as we look at this, because if you notice here, let's go back. Okay. After these things, I'm back in 18. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. He came to them. So, because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. Let me tell you something. When I read that right there, and I tell people all the time, and some guys get mad at me, but I believe that you ought to always beware of those who have found prosperity in preaching, but never had their hands on a plow. One thing about me, I have never been allergic to work. What I've done is I've pressed my faith, trusting that God would grant me the opportunity to have people, family, friends, church members, believers to support the work that I do. But if I have to be a hamburger flipping, French fry frying, chicken frying, table waiting, whatever I have to be, then I will do that. And everybody who is truly called, we understand that. It's the difference is this, is when you have the conviction, and God knows those who are called truly to this ministry. He he bridges gaps for us. He makes ways for us. You look up and your cash app done lit up. You look up and your account was in the negative, and in the morning it's in the positive. But by providence of God here, what we see here, Paul meets this Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla, right? And when we look at them, they worked, they were tent makers. They worked in the leather business. And so Paul says, well, I'm here. I don't know anybody. I'm new to town and I gotta eat. So whatever I need to do, I'm gonna do what I need to do. That listen, you can sit on the dock of the bay if you want to, wasting time, but unless the Lord has allowed you to be in an environment that supports what you're doing, you better go do something else. Because all Jewish boys, and I don't know, some of you may know this or not, but all Jewish boys were expected to learn a trade. That's really how and even with Jesus being a carpenter. So a lot of people don't even know that, but all Jewish boys, they were expected to learn a trade because it was believed that he who does not teach his son to work teaches him to steal. Hmm. Uh, make sure I'm all right here. All right, good. So here it is. It's important to recognize and to understand here that with what God desires for us to do, there we go. I see y'all now. I didn't see y'all. I was trying to see if y'all were still on with me. Praise the Lord. All right. There we go. Okay. So with that in mind, um, yeah, I see you, McKenna. You got to make it do what it do. That's exactly right. So here it is. We see that Paul now, and I want to repeat this one more time because I want to make sure that we're following the narrative here. He starts out great reception, Philippi after being in prison, and the Lord opened the doors, opened the way, and opened the prison. He starts out there, and the Philippian church, man, listen, that's his love church. Let me tell you something. He loved the Philippian church. But as you've seen him, and as we've seen him go through these cities that I've named, you've got to understand that it had to be somewhat discouraging to him in some way. But what Paul did, watch this, y'all. I just had this conversation with Pastor Chris Retton today in Lawton, Oklahoma. And one thing he and I were talking about before he went to his church, he was between assignments, he was between churches. And I used to tell Chris, I used to watch him, he would get his phone, y'all. And on his break on his job, he would go and teach like a 30-minute Bible class with his phone. And it would only be about, maybe five or six of us on there who were watching the live. And he was just saying on how, man, what I understood, and he said by watching me, he said, what I understood is the one thing I can't afford to do is stop doing anything. By the type, don't stop. Yeah, don't stop. He says, I couldn't afford to stop doing anything. And so I told him, and we were talking today. He says, man, I get calls now from guys because he has a wonderful church and a wonderful assignment there in Lawton, Oklahoma. And he says, man, I got guys calling me all the time now. He says, but I was wondering where they were when I was on my phone. He says, man, that was my most discouraging time. That was my time of greatest depression. And I shared this with mom the other day. It's important to realize, you all, that no matter how saved we are, there are some humanistic realities that can bombard our mind and bombard our psyche. But when you commit to continuing to work, and what Paul did was he got to Corinth, he was still focused on sharing the gospel of Christ. He was still focused on making sure that as he shared the gospel of Christ, he was still focused on sharing this word. But he went to work. And every pastor, every missionary thanks God for people like the Aquilas and Priscillas that come along, who have hands, who have hearts, and who have homes, whew, that are dedicated to the work of our Lord. You know, CFC. I mean, I know. I'll say this: CFC headquarters. There in Connecticut. Man, we would make it work wherever we needed to make it work. I remember Reverend Cynthia's. We were talking, and she was trying to figure out how she could maneuver her basement around. If we need to meet sometimes and have church there, and Terry would open up her home, and We'd have fellowship meals, and things of that nature. But Paul, he lived and he worked with Aquila and Priscilla. But on the Sabbath days, y'all, he witnessed very boldly in the synagogues. Notice he was what we call today bivocational. But here's the thing: the purpose of him coming to Corinth was not to go to work, but to minister. God knew that. God God sent him there. So for the purpose of that, he would go, he would work, he would go to the synagogue, and he would witness boldly in the synagogue. Now, when Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, you got to believe, man, he was extremely excited. Keep in mind, he originally went to Corinth by himself. God blessed him to connect with Aquila and Priscilla. He winds up getting a job. I'm assuming that he lodged at their home. But now Timothy and Silas have shown up from Macedonia. And guess what, y'all? While he was staying busy doing what he was supposed to do, guess what they did? They brought the boy an offering. Because the Philippian church had sent financial aid to him, so much so to where it allowed him to devote all of his time now to preaching the gospel. So as we look at this tonight, um, I don't know who this is for, but whatever you have to do, keep doing it. Whatever you have to do, keep going. It's always too soon to quit. Okay. So let's look at a couple of things here. And I've got about 19 minutes, but I want to just point out a few things that just really stuck out to me. Let's skip down to, let's go to verse 5. It says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. Are y'all reading verse 6? But when they opposed him and blasphemed, he shook his garment and said to them, your blood be upon your own heads. I am clean. Now, again, whenever God is blessing a ministry, you can expect increased opposition. Whenever he's blessing a ministry, you can expect increased opposition. It's going to happen. But guess what? With increased opposition, I wish I had somebody. You can also expect increased opportunities. Yeah. Because in and Paul really talks about this over in First Corinthians around chapter 15, 16. He talks about how there was a great and effective door that had opened to him. But he also says, and there are many adversaries. Listen, I think it was Brother Lil Wayne who said, what did he say? Uh, if you ain't got no haters, you ain't doing enough. Yes, sir. So we've got to recognize here, Paul is there, and the people that you would think would be the easiest people to minister to because they have the traditional history, they have the information. So Paul is saying, let's reveal what's been concealed and let's understand what all of this history is about. While he was there, are y'all reading this? They opposed him and blasphemed him. That's what it says right here. But I want to show you something else. Remember I told you about Corinth? Told you what type of city it was? I can promise you, anytime you're invading the enemy's territory, he's going to get angry. Let me back it up right quick, because the last thing he wants to do is to see those in bondage freed. This is why it's important to understand that when Jesus says in Matthew 16, he says, "Upon this rock I will build my church. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." I've shared this many times before, and I'll share it again tonight because I think this is a great place to put it. When he says the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, he is not speaking about the church having to take a defensive posture to defend itself against hell. He's speaking about the church taking an offensive posture, saying that when you go in my name and with my power, the hell or the gates of hell cannot stop you. And so, therefore, Paul believed that. Paul goes into these territories, but Paul also understood that when I get into these territories, when I move into these areas, the enemy is going to get angry. He's going to attack, because the last thing he wants to do is for you to come in and allow the eyes, the spirits, the hearts, and the lives of those who have been bound to be opened to a liberating love that Jesus expressed on Calvary. So it says the unbelieving Jews here, they rejected Paul. Now, if we've been into action for any amount of time, we know that this is something that Paul has probably become very acquainted with now. He's gotten used to rejection, and he's gotten used to the fact that when he's ministering, that rejection would come. The strange thing, I wonder if y'all have picked up on this. The strange thing is that all the rejection keeps coming from the synagogue. It keeps coming from the church folks. And such opposition like this, whenever you see that, y'all, is proof that God is at work. Look what he says. Verse 6, they opposed and blasphemed. He shook his garments and said to them, "Your blood be upon your heads. I'm clean." Look what he says. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. Listen, I don't know if I'm kin to Paul, but he's got to be a close cousin of mine, because that's me. A lot of people wonder why, and when I say a lot of people wonder, I hear musings and statements of my colleagues and contemporaries on how they always question, why are you going here? Why are you going there? Why don't you come into the church, quote unquote? Why don't you come into the church? Well, the church don't seem to be wanting a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to this thing called salvation, the grace of God, the redemptive work of Jesus Christ, because the church has already decided what salvation is, who can and who does not qualify for the grace of God. I wish I had somebody catching this. Paul said, "Listen, I'm not going to go through all this with y'all. You all who are supposed to know better don't know better, because you become more ignorant because of the information that you've been receiving from these hucksters who have been, let me just say it, who've been pimping the pulpit based upon their presentations. And because you like the entertainment aspect of it, you're sitting here getting fat. And the reason you're getting fat is because you're filling up on empty calories. I feel like I'm teaching right now. Yeah. So Paul, he says, or the text says, no, he said it. He shook his garment. Now, y'all see that right there? Because to shake out your garment, um, it's an act of judgment. In other words, listen, you've had your opportunity. Paul says, all right, I'm done. It's what we would do when we say we wash our hands of it. So when I go out here, let me see if I can bring it to a contemporary context. So when I take my little keyboard and my little sound system and my little drums and my little microphone, and I go out here to the park and I set up and I start preaching and I start singing and I start worshiping and I start sharing the gospel out there. And when people come, don't start asking me to start coming into the synagogue because you see the attractional aspect of what's going on. Paul said, forget that. I'll take my show on the road. I wish I had somebody catching this. He said, I'll take my show on the road. He said, from now on, it's right there in verse 6, y'all. From now on, I'll go to the Gentiles. And watch this, y'all. He departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, who worshiped God. Watch this, y'all. Whose house was next door to the church. Listen, are y'all seeing this? Because every time I get to this part, I just always I just crack up because my man said, I have more of an experience with God in my house than the place y'all call the church. Ain't nobody liking me tonight. It says this. He went to the certain man named Justus, his house. Now, don't y'all think that it is some small nuance that Luke says the man's house was next door to this God? That's put in there on purpose to let us know that you can be in the church house and not in the church. And you can be next to the church house and be in the church. Lord have mercy. I wish I had somebody. It says, then Crispus, watch this, the pastor at the church, verse number 8. Are y'all reading this? He believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. Wait a minute. I'm about to shut it down. I'm about to be through, which is why I didn't want to go past, I really didn't want to go past verse 8. But I do want to just see this one part and we'll close it out. But I want you to really see the action here. That's why I call it the action. I think, Terry, I always think about you because you encourage me so much when you say, man, I just love the action because it's really an action narrative, right? Paul, he says, okay, I'll try to preach to y'all in the church, but y'all don't want little Ray Ray, pistol starter, pierced ears, tattoos. Um, y'all don't want all that in here because that's not for in here. I'm trying to give you a contemporary narrative now. Paul says, I tell you what, I'm gonna wash my hands of this. I'm not going to try to convert church folks. What I'm going to work on is what Jesus talked about when he says, I came for the lost house of Israel. I'm going to do what Jesus did. I came for the sick, not the well. Um, Paul goes next door. Two things I want you to catch. He's outside of the church, quote unquote, right? And he goes next door where one man is worshiping in the house. Keep in mind, you got, I would imagine if it's a city of 200,000 people in Corinth, in this synagogue, you might have had three or 400 people in there, quote unquote, worshiping. But the power of ministry was not effective in the synagogue, but he goes right next door and where we only have one name. Look at what the text says. Crispus, the pastor of the church, had to come out the church next door to believe on the Lord with all his household. And now the church, quote unquote, has been both stealthily and overtly relocated from that address to this address. I wish I had somebody catching this. And it's when Paul left the quote unquote church and went outside, the text says, and many of the Corinthians hearing, believed, and were baptized. Somebody type this. Go outside. Yeah, go outside. If the whole point of us when we first began studying the book of Acts, if you those of you that have been with us from the beginning, I started telling you from the very beginning that the reason we study this book is because it becomes the model of how ministry is to be executed and how the operation of ministry is supposed to be performed. We are not supposed to be stuck at believing that ministry can only happen in a certain place. We're not supposed to be stuck in believing that worship can only take place in a certain place because wherever God is, church can be. I'm closing out. Let me see my time. Oh, Lord, my time is called up. Let me get ready to close this out as we see this. Let me see here on how I'm going to wrap this up in verse number 9 because I want you to see this. Okay? It says, many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed, and were baptized. Look at verse 9, y'all. Now I'm going to introduce this tonight because I'm closing this part out. It says, now the Lord, he spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. It says, Paul, son, don't be afraid. Speak. Matter of fact, he tells him this, y'all. He says, matter of fact, don't keep silent. I'm done. I'm going to pick this up next week. Verse 10, he says, "For I'm with you. No one will attack you." And where he says no one will attack you to hurt you, he's not saying no one will attack you. It's just that no one will attack you and I let them hurt you. He says, "For I got my people, many of them, in this city." So what did we learn tonight from Paul? Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, now Corinth. Even when he gets to Corinth, because even though we saw the success of Paul, there had to have come a time that he might have felt like those little boys assumed about that man shoveling the snow. Man, we make our money by coming in and finishing jobs where people want to quit. And Paul kept going. Even, watch this, getting a job. But he didn't have to stay on it long because God made a way. Timothy, Silas, here they come. Watch this, y'all. Came from traveling behind him, but brought an offering from the churches that they had planted because the people there recognized the importance of Paul being able to go on and share this good news with the rest of the world. What an encouragement that was. And even as we look at Paul's situation, when we look at Paul and as we look at where Paul was when we're talking about where he was in the synagogue and he had next door. All right. Next door to the church house. Watch this, y'all. He went to a house church. If y'all remember when the pandemic first hit, the very first sermon I preached when the official shutdown took place was entitled House Party. And the point that I was making in that message was that those of us who really know God understand that it's not about us going to the house of worship, but making a place for worship in our house.